Cui Zhongrong, presented to my beloved. It's good fortune that we live near each other, meeting each other, but not intimate. Like the moon amidst in clouds, like a reflection in the mirror. To see you is to sorrow in vain. Hard to be broken-hearted in spring. I wish I were a swallow dwelling on your beams, but have no means to transform this body. So here we start with an interesting new contribution, which is that of a female poet. I think we've mentioned previously that most traditional Chinese Tang Dynasty poetry is done by scholar officials, and there were other people making also poems, but generally they fare less well in the collections. They are a little bit discriminated against. So for example, religious poetry and religious poets, explicitly religious Buddhist, Daoist poets, tend to be underrepresented in the collections. Even secular, there's even poets who are Buddhist monks who write secular poetry tend to be a little bit discriminated in the anthologies. That's this stereotypical figure is a scholar official with a strong Confucian bent. Women are also very underrepresented. Although we should say that writing the poetry of the Tang basically implied being a scholar official and having a Confucian mentality. Women could not compete for posts in office, so most of them didn't get the training, perhaps the education, and for composing this sort of poetry which they would need for succeeding in public office, where women would not necessarily have any access to begin with. Still, we have a significant number of women, especially courtesans, who lived in the entertainment quarters and who were expected, especially the high level ones that interacted with scholar officials or candidates to scholar officialdom, and they were supposed to be able to produce poems. These poems tend to be a bit monotonous. They're mostly love poems and they're mostly short, and I'm not too keen on love poetry myself. But anyway, so Cui Zhongrong, of which we've read a poem a few minutes ago, was a Daoist priestess poet. This is interesting. So in the Tang Dynasty, there was a flourishing of Daoist priestesses or nuns, if you wish. So these were women that, unlike Buddhist nuns, they lived together, but in a community of sorts. But a lot of them were of high status, and the type of life they had to lead was not the same as a Buddhist nun with very strict ascetic practices and even celibacy. A lot of these nuns were members of the royal family or aristocratic families, and they were endowed with these houses, and they could accede to this religious priestess or nun status as a way of just having a nice lifestyle and not being forced to remarry again after widowhood. So I'm not sure how strict the rules of celibacy, if any, Taoist nuns had to implement, but a lot of them led lives of dalliance with scholar officials or even with emperors. And this seems to be the case of this Cui Zhongrong. We don't know much about her. She flourished in the 8th century and was a Daoist priestess poet. Her poems, which are not many, she has, let me see, 3 poems and 4 couplets. They survive in a collection called the Jiaoqi Xinjiangji, collection of new songs from the Turquoise Pond, which is an anthology of Tang female poets. She was a priestess of the Shangqing, or highest clarity tradition, which was a Taoist school from the south of China that had flourished in the 6 dynasties and continued to flourish in the Tang. But most of her poems, if not all of them, are about, amorous encounters or the allusion to such possibilities. And the poem that we've read, which seems to be a rare pentasyllabic regulated poem, follows that tradition. So it's the poetic persona lamenting unrequited love. So that's the topic, unrequited love. The speaker loves another person who lives nearby but who is unattainable or is not attracted to the poetic persona. And the poem laments this. And then that's the topic of the poem, really. Lots of Tang poems are like this. What makes this distinct is the fact that it is written by a woman. So in a way, it could be representing unrequited female desire, which generally is not a topic of scholar official poetry except by indirectness. That is, scholar officials sometimes write poems, love poems, in which they adopt a female persona. But this is probably one of the earliest examples that I'm aware of a poem which articulates a woman's desire, not as an object, but as a subject, a desiring woman. Well, I mean, you already had poems like this in the Shi Jing, in the Book of Odes, but I mean, within the traditional scholar official tradition of the Shi, of the pentasyllabic Shi, this is probably relatively new. Cui Zhongrong also has another poem that she wrote to a singing girl. It's called Sang Geji, presented to a singing girl, which again is probably one of the earliest examples of exchanges between female writers, or at the very least between female writers and readers. So let's take a look at this poem couplet by couplet as usual. This is pretty straightforward. It's not too cryptic or hermetic, which I suspect also happens in a lot of the female poetry of the time, because of the context of production. As I said, it's not meant to be extremely cryptic, and it's meant to be consumed in entertainment quarters with scholar officials. So it has to be just formal and elaborate and sophisticated enough, but no more than enough. It doesn't have to be particularly showy or erudite. First couplet: it's good fortune that we live near each other, meeting each other, but not intimate. So the poem, the first couplet locates the topic very straightforwardly. The title already says, presented to my beloved, Seng Su Su. So the first couplet says, oh, how nice it is, we know each other, but here comes the bad thing. We meet each other, but we're not intimate. So the poetic persona is torn between these two feelings, which inaugurate the poem. I'm happy that you're near me, but I'm not so happy because you don't like me that much. You don't feel attracted towards me. And the next couplet will develop this lack of mutual affection and the suffering that it produces on the poetic persona. Second couplet: like the moon amidst in clouds, like a reflection in the mirror. Second couplet is the typical parallelistic one, and here we have two images that are meant to be the natural correlates of this closeness, but not quite. And two images are used: the moon amid the clouds and a reflection in the mirror. Both are images of things that are clearly visible, but physically unattainable. You can see the moon, but you can't reach it. You can see your reflection in the mirror, but you can't touch it. Well, you can't go through the mirror. So the poetic persona is feeling like this. I can see you, but I can't grasp you. I can't get to you. And this is clarified in the next couplet as well. If it weren't clear enough with the metaphors, the next couplet, the third one, tells us, to see you is to sorrow in vain, hard to be broken-hearted in spring. So the poetic persona suffers because she, because it's, we might as well assume that it is a female poetic persona. She sees the beloved one, but, it's in vain because proximity in this case does not give access to romantic liaison. It just gives rise to frustration. And we have a seasonal element in the second line of the couplet, hard to be broken-hearted in spring, which connects with something we've talked about in a lot of poems, the correlation of nature and feeling in Chinese poetry. It's a very typical topic. Sometimes nature jars, it plays a jarring note in that the apparent objective feelings of the season or of nature are at odds with the feelings of the humans, as in this case, spring is the season of love, of getting together, but here it's spring, but there is no getting together between the lovers. So there is a contrast, there is an antithetic relationship between the macrocosmos and the microcosmos. And finally, the last conclusion, the last couplet, which it ends up with an image. Generally, the last couplet moves us again to a summary of the poem, but also to a direct manifestation of feeling. In this poem, feeling has been expressed all through it. So So that would be a bit redundant. So it ends up actually with a lovely image, which is a traditional one. Swallows appear already again also in the Shi Jing as images of conjugal happiness. I wish I were a swallow, dwelling on your beams, but have no means to transform this body. So the poem ends with this pathetic image, full of pathos, of emotion, where the poetic persona wishes to be an object that is perpetually closed to the other person and dwelling in his house, so with all the overtones of being together with you. But I have no means to transform the body. I can't do this. I can't change myself. Maybe make myself likable enough for you to love me and dwell with me. And again, as I said, swallows were a symbol of conjugal happiness. So, interesting poem. Pretty standard love poem in a certain way, but again, the fact that it's written by a woman gives it, a certain I don't know, je ne sais quoi, further development in meaning and in overtones that are pretty interesting.